Okay, we just want to welcome Sara McCready here to our lovely video series on toxic relationships and business. And Sara is a toxic relationships coach. Is that right, Sara?
Yeah.
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 And she's going to share a little bit with us today about her own personal experience with building a business and being in the toxic relationship. So let's get started here. So I guess Sara, first, what I just kind of want to ask you is, what kind of
Mm.
business do you own and like work in currently?
Yeah. So you're right. I'm a toxic relationship coach, but I title myself a toxic relationship specialist and intuitive mentor. And so I have created a one-to-one mentorship program for women who have left a toxic relationship because it's a very different story before you leave and after you leave. And so I work with women who are typically a year out because that first year is so challenging and there's so much happening that you're not really able to receive or process the experience in the same way as you are after the first 12 months. It's, such a whirlwind those first 12 months out that I like to work with women who have already stepped out, started on their journey. And I came into this space and place. I actually was going to be a Reiki practitioner or an energy healer. That was going to be the primary business. But because of the global health crisis, our experience here, I'm in Canada, our experience here in the province that I live in was similar to you guys in that we were locked down a lot more than the rest of the world. So I wasn't able to see people in person.
Yeah.
So it became obvious that I needed to move my business online. So that's how the online aspect of it grew. And then because like attracts like, and I have chosen this path to share the wisdom and work with women on healing from toxic relationships. That's what was coming into me. Anybody that was coming to see me for Reiki was a woman who had experienced a toxic relationship. And then when I began my mentorship, obviously that's what was coming in were those women that had been through it and had left and were ready to move forward. So it's essentially an online business now, and it is specifically for women who have left a toxic relationship.
That's amazing and that's so inspiring. And it's amazing that you've created a space there that's safe for those women to come in and to really process what's going on for them. Because as
Yeah.
personally, I know that I've also been through a toxic relationship, and I have to admit, yeah, that first
Mhm.
year was an absolute mess to kind of
Yeah,
like navigate through.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. There's so much that's happening and everything's so heightened and there's so much confusion. Like it's all you can do to be able to get yourself up and get dressed in the morning and
mm,
and if you have kids, if children, then it's an
yeah.
even extra added layer that you're navigating in this shell of numbness. So
Hmm.
yeah, that first year is really a cocooning year. It's about trying to get your bearings. I don't even recommend that you try to process what happened in that first year because it really is just about survival and getting your feet on the ground again. And then after the first year, you can start to unpack what was that.
Yeah, well, yeah, what was that?
What was that? Yes.
Okay, awesome. So I guess like going into your own story now around your own experience with toxic relationships. My first
Mm.
question is for you basically is I guess what was your own upbringing like in your family of origin?
Yeah. So I didn't know, and I've shared this with you in our messages. I didn't know that I was in a toxic relationship when I left the last one. There was four in total. They were long term, about 5 or 6 years for each of them. So it was over a 25-year period of my life because it started when I was in my 20s
Yeah.
and I am 52 now. So it was after this fourth one, which was actually a marriage, and I had not married the other three. I'd never been married before. So it was the first time I'd been married. And the idea of narcissism and toxic relationship came up, like it came up in my feed on YouTube. And I was like, I don't even know what that is. And I went to click on another video, and the video about a narcissistic relationship came up instead, even though I didn't click on it. I clicked
Yeah.
somewhere else, but that's what came up, and it opened up. And she caught my attention enough within the first minute that I sat and listened to the whole 15-minute video. And literally had my jaw on the ground because I was like, oh my God, that's me.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't until I started unpacking that fourth relationship that I realized that it began at home. So I was 9 months out of the relationship when I found that video. And then it was another 2 months after that. So it was basically December.
Yeah.
I will never forget this because it was just before Christmas. We celebrate Christmas. So it was just before Christmas, and I was in my bedroom, and the thought that came through was, it takes one to know one. I heard that phrase. And then as soon as I heard that, I remembered my mom's disapproval of all of my previous relationships, like really strongly disapproved.
Mm-hmm.
And then with this, it takes one to know one. And then the realization, the dawning that that is where it all began for me. It was that relationship dynamic between her and I. And it was troubled. I knew it was a difficult relationship. There was favoritism. I have a biological sister and a stepsister. So the biological sister and I lived together and with our mom full time. And
Mm-hmm.
so there was like this weird dynamic that was always there. I'd always seen it ever since I was little and felt it because it was very obvious. There was lots of confrontation with my mom, um, strong, like codependent behaviors that I now recognize as
Yeah.
codependent behaviors. So lots of control issues. You know, I had a very strict curfew up until high school, even like even past grade 9, I still had a bedtime curfew of like maybe 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
It was late in high school before I could like go out and be home late and all of those things. And yeah, just very aloof and hands off, like not a very nurturing person, except for in moments. There'd be these moments of like real nurturing and comfort. But I always knew that if I wanted comfort, it wasn't going to be from her.
Yeah.
So it was just really um, like I said, a lot of that codependent behavior where she was controlling the environment and everything in it and not allowing us to have a say, not allowing that independence or even interdependence because she didn't know what that was.
Mm.
And it's now again, as I've healed and gone through this process, this journey, I can see in her family lineage how long this has been going on for. It wasn't, you know, she did the best she could with the tools that she had, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm absolutely at peace with it now. But that December before Christmas, having that realization that it all stemmed from there and how I had learned those behaviors, it made for a very challenging Christmas that year.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very challenging. I had a hard time like looking at her. I've unpacked it now and processed it, but because it was so fresh before that Christmas, like literally a week or two before Christmas was when that all filtered in. And so I hadn't processed it. So I had a very hard time, you know, being in her company that year because I
Yeah.
still needed some more time to unpack what that really was all about. So, yeah, it was very strained and it took a long time before we connected. I think I was in my 30s before I made peace with who she was and what our relationship was like, and that forgiveness came in. But it was another uh, 20 years before I realized that she had these, you know, strong codependent and toxic personality behaviors. So
Yeah.
it's been a journey.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like with obviously personal development and when awareness and stuff, it takes time to kind of really um kind of open yourself up to seeing different things at different times. Like you just don't know what you don't know until you do. Um,
Yeah.
but I guess like my next question for you would be like to talk a little bit about these four different relationships that you had and how each of them were toxic in themselves. You
Mm,
obviously said that already that you didn't notice until after the fourth relationship.
yeah.
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 Obviously my question about when did you notice it going toxic is not going to be relevant to you right now. But like I would love to know a little bit about how each of those relationships were toxic in themselves.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about that relationship journey, that 25-year journey, was that there was alcoholism in my family of origin as well.
Yeah.
So on my mom is, and there's alcoholism on that family line as well. So, so that was a factor. So the first long-term boyfriend, was the first person I had moved in with from home. So it was
Mhm.
after college, and then we moved in together. And in that instance, it was just a lack of motivation. There wasn't alcohol or drugs at play, but there was definitely what we now identify as codependent behaviors. So where I was trying to provide, so I ended up getting a really good full-time job out of college, and I was paying for everything. And so this went on for about a year. He was in and out of work and then not in work for a really long period of time at the end there. And it began to get really draining because I was the only one in the relationship and I was the only one invested in the relationship. Except at the time, I didn't understand what that dynamic was. I just knew that we were struggling because I was the only one bringing money in, and it was becoming a challenge to pay for just about anything. Like we were beyond stretched. And so it was the burden of finances that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back in that relationship, and the fact that there wasn't any more engagement. We had stopped sharing a bedroom, we had stopped communicating. He finally did get another job, maybe a few months before I left, and at that point it was kind of like too late. The damage had been done, and I
Mhm.
was like 25 or 26 at the time. So there was no coping skills on my part. And it was completely unhealthy in terms of my well-being, my emotional well-being. And I knew that because I was starting to get colds all the time. I was calling in sick to work. I started feeling depression, which I hadn't felt before. So I'd be like
Mhm.
super sleepy and not want to get out of bed and be in bed all weekend long and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
So I pulled myself out. I actually did a rebound relationship. I met somebody else through a group of friends and went directly from my living arrangement relationship to like the Friends place on TV, the show Friends, like where a
Yeah.
bunch of people are living together. And the new guy that I was seeing was in there. So I basically jumped into another relationship. That relationship ended up being super, super toxic because there was alcohol involved. So it came to light that he was an alcoholic. And so it took a lot of back and forth. It took me about a year or more to really untangle from that. We'd break up for a couple of months, and not just a couple, but at one point it was 6 months that we'd broken up, and then we got back together again. And so this went on for a good year and a half before I finally was able to call it quits, because I understood the level of alcoholism was not going to be addressed, and that wasn't the way that I wanted to live. I had made that very clear to myself, and I recognized that there was no forward movement with that relationship. So that one I left on my own. and took the time to heal. So in between the next 3 relationships, I was always on my own for about 2, 3, sometimes 4 years.
Yeah.
So that's also why it was over a 25-year period. I was taking time to really do the healing work. And that it was after that relationship that I got into personal development. I started taking courses. I took a really extensive weekend program. Are you familiar with Landmark Education? Do you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I did their first weekend, and then I proceeded to go for the next 3 levels that they offer.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, so that was really the beginning. I'm now at this point, my mid 30s. And this is when the transformation really began. And that's when I made peace with my mom being who she is. I made peace with the previous 2 relationships, and I knew what I wanted in my life. And I was in a corporate environment, so I'd started elevating in that job that I had, and there was really great forward momentum. And then I met the 3rd relationship. Like I said, been on my own for maybe about 3 years at this point. And I knew that I wanted to have a partner, but that I didn't need somebody. I was very secure in who I was. I'd healed a lot, but there was still a piece missing, which I didn't know. So I entered into the 3rd relationship, and he was 10 years younger than me. And so it was a very tumultuous dynamic because of the age and stage of life, but then also because alcohol, drugs, and gambling addiction became part of the package. So at that time of my life, social drinking was very much a part of my world. And so whenever I met somebody or went on a date, there was always alcohol involved. And so with this fellow, there was, getting to know you. So we would have drinks, and that was always part of it. So I didn't question the alcohol consumption until after we had moved in together. And then it began to escalate. And that relationship, we did break up for a year, and then we got back together because this was the piece that I hadn't healed yet, and I didn't realize that I hadn't healed, was that self-worth piece. So I'd gotten a lot of clarity prior to meeting him about who I was and what my values were. But I didn't recognize that there still wasn't boundaries, and there wasn't that full understanding of my self-worth.
Yeah.
So when we got back together, I ended up buying a house. So I'm also still, one of the main themes that continued through all 4 was that I continued to pay for everything.
Yeah.
And so on this 3rd relationship, I ended up buying a house. It was the first house I bought, with the understanding that we would be getting married. And that's why we were getting back together. Well, within not even 8 hours of moving in together, it was the day we moved in together, he drank a lot, to say the least. And it was a huge fight. And there was some violence, but not physical violence. So I was very, very afraid and wondered what the heck I had done and where do you go from here? And, obviously felt like I had made the biggest mistake of my life, but I just bought a house. And how do you get out of a house? It's not like a lease on an apartment or a condo. So I hung in there for another year, and within the year, I was able to get him to leave without a whole lot of chaos. There was a little bit at the end, but not terribly. And so again, I took another 3 years between that relationship and the next one. And the next one was someone that was known to me. So the fourth relationship was somebody that I had known in high school and had dated in high school. And so they reached out and just connected on Facebook, and then asked about having a coffee date. And so we met, and the first date turned into 3 dates, and everything happened very, very quickly.
Yeah.
This, now what I understand to be a red flag, one of the hallmarks for me is how quickly all of these relationships happened.
Yeah.
The third relationship, we'd only been dating for maybe 4 months when he moved in with me. Like I said, the second relationship, I bounced from the first right into the second. We started living together right away. And so there's now the understanding of these red flags that I didn't recognize before, but this one, the fourth one, was really next level. So the speed of which it moved didn't leave room for any processing. So we were engaged about 2 months after we met. We were married a year after we'd gotten engaged, almost a year to the day.
Wow.
And yeah. So, and then things really started escalating with that relationship. There were things that were happening inside that relationship that hadn't occurred in the previous 3. So there was no drugs and alcohol in this fourth relationship, but there was massive, massive emotional abuse, which I didn't recognize for what it was. I had no idea. I'd never had an experience of that. So it was earth shattering. It is the relationship that, as I've shared with you, cracked me open, because I became completely undone mentally, emotionally, and physically. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced before.
And I resonate with you on that. I definitely had a very similar experience to your fourth relationship as well. And it is a very hard one to understand, because it's because of the emotional abuse. It sets you up to believe that this is actually who you are, and that this broken version of yourself, or they say, or is the problem and the reason and the whole basis for why this relationship isn't working very well. But the truth about it is that they've actually created this systematically to break you down and to continue to keep you where they want you to be.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I felt very much, again, after that first year that I was out, I started to see the whole relationship in a new light. Obviously, the blinders were off. The rose-colored glasses, as I call them, were completely off. I wasn't naive, because a lot had happened in my life prior to meeting him. I'd had a lot of maturity and experience, life experience, but what I still had a little bit of innocence left in me, and that was completely gone at the end of this relationship. And there was, like you said, that mental abuse, that emotional abuse, that mental manipulation. I now know that that was targeted. Like I said, I was known to him. He saw all my shiny pictures on Facebook, and I totally believe I was absolutely targeted. I know that now. But at the time, it was, all the love bombing, like everything you could think of, it all happened, all the fairy tale stuff. And that really fed into that that desire that I had to get married. Getting married was a big deal to me. It was sacred. It meant something. Having gone through 3 relationships before and wanting to marry each of them. The only reason I was in those relationships was because I wanted to marry those people until I
I
didn't
didn't.
until it
Yeah.
became obvious that no, you don't.
Yeah.
These are not healthy relationships. I didn't have the same language that I have today, but I knew that they weren't healthy and I shouldn't be marrying them. But with him, I was like, this is it. I've finally done my work. I've landed where I need to be. This is the partner for me. We're so in sync,
Mhm.
and he had had kids. So because I dedicated my life to my job, again, lack of boundaries.
Mhm.
And
Codependent.
because, yeah, and because I'd spent, my what I call fertile years inside of other unhealthy relationships, my window by the time I met him was almost nil for having children. And so he had kids. And so it was just like this utopia for me. I had a blended family and I understood blended family dynamics because I'd come from one, and
Yeah.
this was going to be it. And so the level of devastation when I realized that it wasn't going to be it, um, is what's, brought me to where I am today.
I can 100% say that is the big reason why I'm also where I am today. It is a very,
Yes.
as much as you don't want to give them any credit, um,
Yeah.
the situation as a whole is very can be very life transforming because
Yes.
that
Yes.
undoing of you creates this new kind of perception of yourself that you have to rebuild, and
Yeah.
that rebuilding you.
It's a new identity. We
Mhm.
build new identities. And this is, what I teach inside my program. I talk about this all the time. You're not the same person. These relationships are meant to transform you. They are transformative. If you want to go down the spiritual path, they're karmic and they're meant to be transformative. It is for you to grow. And they
Mhm.
actually, as tragic and traumatic and painful as they are 100% transformative. You are
Mhm.
the phoenix rising from the ashes through these relationships, and you become someone else because the trauma
Yeah.
changes your neural pathways. You are changed at the cellular level after these relationships. So you don't look at life the same way. Like I said, what little bit of innocence I had, it was stripped. But that's what needed to happen for me to take my next level of growth, my personal growth up. And I'm absolutely, like you said, I don't give credit to him, but I definitely know that that experience occurred for my highest and best. That occurred for me, not to me. And
Yeah.
that's a pivotal um, turning point when you get to that place and space of understanding that these relationships actually are for you. It
Yeah.
does not feel like that for a while, but when you get there, you can see, because there was so much that has come into my world as a result of having that experience now.
Yeah.
That wouldn't have happened otherwise.
No, you would have just been like blissfully unaware, continuing in the same lifestyle, like
Yeah.
still in the
Yep.
corporate world, still, picking the same sort of
Bouncing
men.
from relationship. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Same guy, different face.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it's too is like if we think back as well, like this is kind of where I go with like how I teach and stuff is we create a fantasy when we're a child of who we want this man to be. And
Yeah.
we pick guys and we make them try to fit that fantasy.
Yeah.
And once we can let that fantasy go and actually see reality for what that really is, we can actually see people for who they really are. But until we do, we want to
Yes.
create that.
Yes.
We want to create that aesthetic and like fit these people in
That's
and
right.
push them in.
That's
It just
right. And
problems.
speaking of the aesthetic, this is the interesting thing for me is that all four of them look completely different. My ideal was always in my mind was always tall, dark, and handsome.
Yeah.
None of them, oh, the third one sort of fit that description,
Yeah.
but the other three did not fit that description at all, because it was the energy that I was drawn to.
Mhm.
It was that sense of familiarity. So in relationships, as you probably share, we're drawn to what's familiar, not necessarily what's healthy for us. So I kept being drawn in to
Yeah.
these toxic patterns because that's what felt healthy and normal to me. Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
a really big trap for some women to fall into, because I know personally for myself, when I met that really toxic person, when I first sat down with him, he felt like home. And I thought that was a good
Yes.
thing. But
Yes. Yes.
really, like, I needed to
Same.
run.
Yeah. Now we know. But in that moment, yes, it felt like you said, the fantasy. It felt like everything it was supposed to be. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I guess for me too, like going forward now here, do you notice any like um repetitive kind of patterns as well in your other interpersonal relationships with different people still popping up now, or do you feel like you're able to
Yeah.
kind of see people for who they are?
So, one of the things about having your innocence stripped away fully and completely, and the rose-colored glasses completely removed, is that you do see things differently. And so I can hear things, I can hear the subtext now that I couldn't hear before. I'm a big proponent of words and actions.
Hmm.
So with this last one, with this fourth relationship, there was definitely a lot of misalignment between words and actions that I wasn't able to reconcile in my brain, because I just kept going, but he says we're married. He says we're still together. He says he wants to be a
Hmm.
family. I just kept going to he says.
Yeah.
I wasn't able to reconcile that he was no longer sleeping with me. He never came home anymore. And he was never with the kids. They were either with me or their mom. So, so that it, that lesson has, yes, translated into my real world now. I'm able to identify, there's language that you can hear after you've been through a toxic relationship that you don't hear necessarily before it, before you've started to recognize the signs. And that language is very audible to me now. So I can hear the subtext, I can hear what's not being said. And the minute their words and actions don't align, I'm done. And I have noticed that a lot of friends obviously have cleared away, like
Yeah.
some of those relationships that weren't healthy, like girlfriends that weren't healthy for me. Those relationships have just, they just faded. Like that was it. We just drifted apart. And so, and also too, my experience happened. I left in January of 2019. So this was just before COVID. So
Yeah.
a lot of my experience happened during COVID times. So
Yeah.
it's kind of hard to say. Was it circumstantial or was it because I've changed? Probably a bit of both.
Yeah. Yeah. But
Yeah.
COVID probably would have been a great time for you to kind of like really reflect and go back
Oh,
into what
totally.
for you.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
obviously to create a business as well, which is, like amazing. So you're able to learn a lot. What
Yeah.
mainly have you like taken from your business, from the situation and learned, and so
Yeah.
that your business can thrive?
Yes. So just to back up a little bit, I was in corporate for 20 years. So for the duration of those four relationships, I worked on what is the equivalent of Wall Street in the USA. It's called Bay Street in Canada. And
Yeah.
so I was in the financial services sector for about 20 years. And then when I met my fourth toxic partner, I ended up leaving that job and then took about a year off, which is how we got married because I actually had time to plan a wedding.
Yeah.
And then I did step back into the corporate world, into a small office closer to where we lived. So there was 3 years in that office, and that 3 years was during the time that I had been married and it unwound, it became undone. So when I started my business, I had been a year out of my relationship, out of my marriage. Um, And I was going to start it in April or May of 2020, but March of 2020 came along. So there was a big delay before I actually opened the doors to my business. And it was because of the healing journey that I went on my fourth relationship that I saw a gap for women specifically on the emotional healing journey. It was even as recent as 4 years ago, there wasn't the level of support that there is today. Nobody understood the mental manipulation that I'd experienced or the emotional abuse. So they were looking at me and I looked like Sara, but I didn't feel like Sara anymore and everything hurt and it was all on the inside. Nobody could see
Yeah.
the grief and the trauma. It's just not visible. So my family was as supportive as they could be, but after, 4, 5, 6 months, they're like, well, come on already, get over it. Yeah. So it was because of that loneliness and that lack of support that I was like, when I started to understand what narcissism is and narcissistic personality disorder, doing all the research and then incorporating the energy healing, I was like, this needs to be talked about. And recognizing that I had 25 years of those relationships, I had a lot to say about it. So I brought forward all of that experience and what I noticed over the last year, what has become really, really obvious is that being an entrepreneur, so starting your own business in whatever capacity it is, after a toxic relationship, the entrepreneurship ends up continuing to be an extension of your emotional healing journey.
Yeah. 100%.
There is so much last year. So 2022 was so revealing because I've moved my business online. I've had to show up online. I've had to create content and do videos and, become a brand basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought I had healed a lot from that fourth relationship. Man, oh man, last year taught me even more.
Yeah.
So you're really like called to pull back those layers. Every time you think you've healed a layer as an entrepreneur, there's something that's going to come up that you're going to have to face, either dealing with customers, even if it's a product-based business,
Mhm.
how your product's perceived, you have to deal with your mind still. And it is a never-ending journey. And that was the biggest lesson I learned, is that this is a never-ending journey, regardless of whether I was an entrepreneur or not. I just feel like being an entrepreneur has heightened it again and revealed more that needs to be processed. But this is an ongoing journey. You will continue to expose another layer. Even if you're going back into a relationship, they say the next relationship after your toxic relationship is probably the most difficult relationship you'll have, even the healthy ones, because you're being called to show up in
Yeah.
your new way and hold your boundaries and do life in a way that you've never done it before. So yeah, that's my advice, is that this is an extension of your healing journey, and don't let that turn you away or turn you off from continuing to move forward. If you've survived a toxic relationship, you can survive entrepreneurship.
Yeah. Oh, amazing. Thank you so much, Sarah, for giving us your time today and sharing your amazing experience that you've had and how it's transforming the lives of, I'm guessing, a lot of people out there in the world right now. And yeah, I just want to thank you for creating that space for some women as well to just be safe and to be able to process their emotions and, like just creating that safe container. Um, yeah. So yeah,
Thank you for your time. It's been a lovely chat, and I've appreciated your time. Thank you.
thank you.